Tonight, we're drifting back about 900,000 years to a twilight in deep time when nearly all our ancestors may have vanished. Stay with me until the end, because this quiet journey holds a surprising twist. The mystery might never have been a single disaster at all, but a long squeeze that almost erased us. And perhaps didn't. Before we begin, where in the world are you watching from? Tell me in the comments so we can fall asleep under the same ancient sky together. Settle in, breathe slowly, and let the story unfold. Imagine the human family narrowed to a whisper, the entire lineage held together by a handful of fires against a wide and changing sky. Picture scattered bands, no more than a few small villages worth of people if you gathered them all, living weeks apart by foot, their paths traced along riverbanks that still remember their ankles. Nights lasted longer then, or at least they felt that way, because the cold had a way of turning time into something you could hear. The crackle of frost, the slow creak of branches, the hush of breath inside cupped hands. Each sunrise was not a guarantee, but a negotiation, and every ember nursed at dawn was an old promise kept. Food arrived in seasons and in moods. Some years, animals moved like a steady tide. Reindeer, wild horses, great aurochs, leaving prints that could be read like gentle writing. Other years, they ghosted past, skirting the margins of human notice, and the people had to make do with roots, seeds, bitter greens pounded to a paste between stones, and the sweet surprise of honey when a brave hand reached into a buzzing dark. Along coasts, where the wind blew clean and salt laid its trace on everything, those small groups learned the rhythm of tides. Mussels pried from cold rocks, fish smoked above slow flames, seaweed dried and knotted like ropes of green. Inland, they learned the language of water holes, the way birds circle and call, the way reeds bend to hide their secrets, the way a thin skin of ice tells you whether to trust it with your weight. Tools were simple, but the craft was not. A good edge on a stone meant the difference between waste and plenty. Hands found the line within the rock. Strike, turn, pressure, lift, until a flake skated free and a blade appeared as if from within. Old blades were retouched again and again, each new notch a memory of previous hunts and previous winters. Fire carried knowledge too, which wood smoulders and which bursts, how to coax a coal from damp tinder with breath paced like a lullaby, how to bank warmth under ash so that tomorrow has a head start. Children watched in the glow and learned without being told. They learned the useful shapes of silence, how to move with the wind, how to stand like a bush when a shadow pauses, how to place a foot where another foot has already pressed the ground flat. The world itself was changing its mind about what it wanted to be. Winters grew deeper, summers shorter, rain wandered off course, and familiar valleys could tilt toward strangeness in a single generation. A meadow that fed a clan might sour and thin. A lake might pull back its shoreline like a curtain. Bands learned to be small on purpose, so they could move with a quickness that matched the world's new tempo. They traveled by landmarks that still exist in some form. Ridges of old stone, crooked trees, a split boulder that looked like a sleeping animal. They spoke names for these places around the fire, not as stories to pass the time, but as coordinates to pass survival. Go to the place where the two hills lean together. Keep the river at your left. Follow the sound of geese. Turn where the ground holds the scent of sulfur. In that thin time, cooperation was not a virtue so much as a good tool, like a knife that fits your hand. Meat was shared not because anyone was saintly, but because no one was safe from the next empty week. Eyes scanned the horizon in pairs. A hunt meant risk. 2 hunters meant a plan. When someone stumbled, another shoulder moved under their arm before the stumble finished becoming a fall. The elderly carried maps in their voices, describing where berries ripen late and which slope gets the first thaw. The young carried the future in their legs, ranging out and returning, testing the edges of the known. Between them, the line held. Language grew thicker with necessity. Maybe words multiplied in the mouth so that a warning could be quick and accurate, so that gratitude could be given in the right shape, so that the exact taste of a plant and the exact turn of a creek could be nailed to memory. Maybe rhythm came from walking, syllables lined up with footfalls, and from the drum of heartbeats when the chase began. Simple phrases did the heavy lifting. There, now, wait, listen, smoke, tracks, safe. From these, larger braids formed. Don't step there. The ground remembers the water. Sleep on the side where the wind forgets your scent. Follow the birds when they argue, not when they sing. Even in whispers, the world was being named into a map you could carry without hands. Fear was a counselor they listened to but did not obey. Big cats were real, and their silence could weigh more than a roar. Hyenas were clever negotiators of darkness. The weather itself could hunt you. Storms arriving with a face of dust or a mouth of ice. To live was to organize your days around wise concessions. Build where the flood can't reach. Sleep where the firelight can see your toes. Walk when the wind is with you. Stop when the light turns to glass. And yet, despite the danger, there were jokes. Even now, you can imagine a punchline sparking across a circle, breath turning to laughter in the cold. The smallest rebellion against a large indifferent season. The body learned what it needed. Feet became books of distances. Hands toughened until a thorn was not a crisis, but a brief negotiation. Eyes measured dusk like a clock. Ears could sort the grammar of wind in grass, from wind breaking against fur. Smell recognized the difference between yesterday's lion and a lion who still owns this hour. Sleep came in shifts arranged around the fire, and dreams braided into waking knowledge, because in dreams old paths return, and old mistakes replay themselves until they become lessons. Across a continent scaled to their stride, families fanned in slow motion, sometimes meeting, sometimes merely sharing the same winter from different directions. When they met, they traded small proofs of other lives. A shell from a beach someone else had never seen. A piece of flint from a far ridge that napped like ice. A song shaped around a rhythm no one could place, but everyone could feel. They traded partners too, in careful rituals that tied bands together into something larger than any campsite. In this way, the line was not just preserved, but stitched and restitched, the thread passing through many hands so it would not fray. There were years of quiet luck, when everything aligned, when calves were plenty and berries puffed with sugar, when tools stayed sharp and the snows arrived as expected. And there were years that asked for everything, and then a little more. In the asking years, they made themselves smaller still, used less wood, spoke less loudly, walked smarter routes, watched the birds more closely, waited out the moods of the land. Patience in that world was not passive. It was a discipline of attention, to sit with a hillside until it tells you where it sheds its water, to test an idea with your feet before you test it with your stomach, to measure a risk by how your grandmother would look at you if you tried it. If you listen closely to that far-off scene, you can hear the gentle arithmetic that kept them going. A mother counts the days until the roots are sweetest. A hunter counts the time between tracks to know how tired the animal is. A child counts the sparks that leap from the fire as if each one were a tiny messenger. A band counts what it can count, calories, distances, hours of light, and trusts what it can't to the reflexes of the group. The math is not written anywhere, but it lives in the way a group rises at the same instant, in the way a hand reaches for a tool that another hand is already passing, in the way a path forms through grass and stays as a faint stripe for months. All the while, the population stays thin, a thread pulled tight, but the thread does not snap. It hums with the tension of endurance. It hums with the giving and taking of small kindnesses, the returning of borrowed tools, the saving of stories for cold nights, the sharing of fat on a better day, the quiet exchanges of glances that mean we keep going, the way feet remember where to fall even when eyes are tired, the way the first ember at dawn feels like a secret passed from one day to the next, the way the landscape, stern as it is, still offers a sign if you learn how to ask for it. The world tightened its grip in slow motion, like a vast hand closing around valleys and coasts and the open steppe, squeezing not with a single catastrophe, but with a long, deliberate rhythm of cold that deepened and held. Winters stretched their shadows, summers arrived short and cautious, the light thinner, the warmth quick to step back. Ice grew patient and heavy in the high places, pressing mountains into powder, combing rock into long, pale strands of dust the wind carried across continents. Rivers that had once sauntered through green banks learned a sharper tone, running narrow and fast, or else flattening into braided threads that lost themselves in gravel beds. Rain forgot some addresses and remembered others too well, visiting one region with spectacular generosity and leaving another to wait under a sky that promised but did not deliver. Forests pulled in their edges like someone gathering a cloak against the weather. Grasslands expanded and then went brittle, their color shifting from lush to caution to bone. In this slow reworking, familiar paths became arguments. A path that had welcomed feet for generations held on to snow late and let it go early, making the window of safe travel a thin slice you had to read correctly. Lakes inhaled and exhaled, some swelling with meltwater that spilled into new channels, others shrinking until their old shoreline stood like rings on a finger that had lost weight. Where the sea withdrew, it revealed shelves of land that had not felt the sun in ages, bare corridors that asked for courage and offered new routes, but also exposed coasts to winds that slapped the face and salted the tongue. Where the sea advanced, it unstitched campsites, soaking hearthstones, and tugging driftwood back into its cold mouth. The people watched these shifts the way one studies an animal, the set of its shoulders, the tilt of its head, the signs of its mood. Everywhere, the world practiced the art of making refuges scarce. Patches of good water remained like scattered coins in a pocket someone had forgotten they owned. Between them stretched belts of risk, where the ground was stingy, and the sky impatient. To move was to make decisions in long sequences. This line of hills will block the wind. This saddle will drain ice melt. This bend in the river will remember fish at first thaw. The land's language changed its grammar without warning. The rain belt slipped a little north, a little south. Monsoon breath faltered and returned in a different key. The storm tracks drew new letters across the season. Those who lived there learned to read in motion, to carry maps in their head that updated with each day's walk. Cold had its own way of teaching. It put a price on every mistake and trusted the lesson to stick. Firewood needed gathering with new patience, not just any wood, but the right wood, the kind that would crackle without smoke when wind laid its hands on the camp. Shelter needed to be chosen where the night's breath couldn't find the back of your neck. Even the ground underfoot became a school. A skin of frost over mud means one thing at dawn and another by mid-morning. And there are days when your own footprints betray you unless you step inside them again. In some winters, the air itself seemed to ring. A high, glassy sound you could almost hear, and on those mornings the camp moved as if under a spell. Voices low, tools handled like precious, fragile things. Animals answered the squeeze with new routes, new timing, new rules. Herds that had once poured like rivers across the plains broke into smaller streams that braided and unbraided according to grasses no human could yet name. Migratory birds reset their clocks by a sun that seemed to keep changing the time. Predators traced the edges of these movements, drawing loops and counter-loops around water and wind, turning the night into geometry. People learned the shapes of these patterns, the way fingers learn a song. A river bend with tracks from yesterday need not have tracks today, but a certain saddle, a certain notch in a ridgeline will still be a throat that animals must pass through when the cold says go. By aligning with these predictable pinch points, small bands could become larger than their numbers. 2 people on a bad day, a plan on a good one. Plants adjusted as quietly as stones. Forest edges retreated into sheltered pockets. A fold in the land that caught a softer light. A south-facing slope that tricked the season into thinking it had a little more to give. Seeds rode with the wind and hid in soil until a brief gift of warmth unlatched them. Berries, when they came all at once, teaching harvesters to remember the exact week when sweetness peaks and birds arrive like a rumor. Roots that had fed families in one decade grew thin and stubborn in the next. Others, once overlooked for bitterness, became reliable companions if you learned the ceremony of soaking, scraping, roasting. The palate of hunger shifted with the palate of the hills until taste itself was a kind of internal compass, pointing you toward what the land had decided to be this year. Water dictated the pace. Springs that once sang all summer began to speak in riddles, trickling, pausing, returning in a new place, sometimes covering their mouths entirely under a lid of frozen grass. Streams braided and unbraided, hiding depth under a skin of quick chatter. People learned to read gloss and shadow, to listen for the lower note a river makes where it pools under undercut banks. In dry months, mud remembered the feet of those who came to drink, deer and boar and the shy, narrow prints that mean caution. In wet months, water forgot quickly, requiring another kind of reading. Color, smell, the taste of silt, the way a reed bends when the current is honest. Camps moved not by whim, but by this arithmetic, stepping from one reliable mouthful to the next. Under the pressure of these shifts, home became less a place and more a choreography. The year unrolled as a sequence of movements rather than a long stay. The late winter shelter behind the shielding outcrop, the early spring bend where fish battered themselves into shallows, the summer ridge where wind cleaned the insects from skin, the autumn valley where fat gathered on the animals like a slow blessing. Each stop held small inheritances, a cache of good stone tucked into a crevice, a shelf of dry kindling under a leaning slab, a story about the lightning that split a particular tree and the shape the split took. The path between these places braided memory into muscle. Feet remembered angles. Hips remembered the lean of a pack. Shoulders remembered the height of a child who would soon be taller. The air itself seemed to learn new tricks. Dust rose on days when the wind wanted a voice, laying a veil across distance that made the horizon come closer than it had any right to be. Snow fell in character, as varied as people, dry and whispering, wet and heavy, knives of ice that clicked against bone, fat flakes that made the whole world breathe more slowly. Fog worked its own magic at dawn, distilling everything into silhouettes. A standing stone, a crouched hunter, a herd paused like punctuation before moving on. Under fog, sounds rearranged themselves so that you had to listen twice to be sure which direction a hoofbeat traveled, or whether that splash was water disagreeing with itself or an animal arguing with water. In some regions, the squeeze made islands without water. Not islands surrounded by sea, but islands of good living surrounded by a sea of almost. These were the places where bands could settle a little, long enough to help elders heal, long enough to teach a knot or a song, long enough to bind a blade with care rather than haste. But islands always invite crossings, and crossings demand choices. Who goes to scout the next refuge? Who stays to keep the old one from vanishing completely from the mind? What to carry and what to hide, and what to say to a child about why the good place cannot be held. These conversations left lines on faces deeper than weather did, and yet there was a steadiness that grew from them, a kind of practiced readiness, like a hand that always knows where the firemaker lies in the dark. Even in the pressure, there were gifts. The long view sharpened. People learned to listen not only to the day's hunger, but to the year's pattern, to the way a certain wind in late summer smells of early frost, to the way the moonlight on a slope can tell you if the grasses there are old or new. Bodies became instruments that could tune themselves to the season's key. Minds, too, grew dexterous, holding multiple maps at once. If the ridge is iced, the valley will flood. If the valley is dry, the pass will carry fog. If the birds are late, the herd will split. This thinking did not feel like shared opinions, so much as shared reflex. A community-level intelligence braided from many small attentions. Sometimes the earth opened its throat and spoke briefly in fire, an ash that turned the sunset copper, a fine grit that settled on the tongue and taught caution for a day or a week, a hiss of ground that meant heat slept close beneath. Those were the days when people moved lightly and kept their spacing, making the camp a loose constellation rather than a cluster. Other times, the earth's voice dropped low and cold in long storms that could rewrite a landscape overnight, reprinting the ridges and combing the scrub into new patterns. After those nights, children woke to a world that looked a degree stranger, and the work of learning began again. Not from the beginning, but from the latest edition. All of this, the squeezing cold, the fickle rain, the moving routes and moving rules, was not an enemy to be beaten, but a teacher that demanded attention. Attention, in turn, grew into a form of softness that could bend rather than break. The land asked questions each day, and people learned to answer with arrangements. How shelters faced, how loads were shared, how tools were placed for the hand that would need them next, how eyes took turns with the horizon so that no one's vision dulled from staring. In this way, the squeeze became a crucible, not by burning away the weak, but by instructing the willing, shaping a style of life that could pass through narrow seasons and come out still in motion, breath clouding the air, footsteps writing careful lines across a world that kept rewriting itself. What keeps a small fire from going out when the wind leans hard on it is not one big piece of wood, but a conversation of smaller things. Dry grass that agrees to catch, twigs that accept the lesson, thicker sticks that arrive only after the flame is sure of itself. In the same way, a few people held on by arranging many small reliables into a chain strong enough to carry days. They learned to begin with what the land would grant, and then drew the rest from attention and patience. Edges of stone were shaped with a humility that understood rock has moods. You strike at the right angle and surrender when the flake refuses, turning the piece and asking again. The best edges were not the sharpest for a moment, but the ones that stayed useful through many meals and many miles. Handles were not complicated, just shaped branches that sat well in the palm, lashed with fibers, teased from bark or sinew, softened and twisted between fingers until it remembered the shape you wanted. Nothing was wasted, because waste is a luxury a small band cannot afford. Broken flakes became scrapers, dull scrapers became burnishers, and the tired tools that could do no more were still teaching devices in children's hands. Hunting worked best when it behaved like water, finding channels, pooling quietly, then moving with sudden resolve. They watched animals as if they were weather, not as targets, but as systems with rules you could learn by watching long enough. Footprints told time and temperature. A pressed edge meant a body that hesitated. A scuffed ridge meant a turn taken in haste. They learned where the wind would carry their scent, and where stone walls nibbled at breezes and threw them upward. It was not always about the chase. Often, it was about placing themselves where a path converged with need, the mouth of a ravine, a narrow saddle, a stream crossing, so that the world did part of the work. A gesture lifted under ribs meant weight. A head tilt toward shade meant circle. A hand pressed down meant stay low. And 2 fingers spread meant the herd had split. The language of motion grew that precise. It helped that hunger sharpens choreography. You do not care who leads if the plan aligns bodies with opportunity. When the land grew stingy, they traded distance for certainty. Traps that could mind themselves were set at the edges of routine. A snare on the faint trail the little hooves favored. A deadfall balanced so neatly that the weight of curiosity would be enough to settle the question. But even snares need stories. You have to know which plants won't spook a careful nose, which stones keep their position when frost puckers the ground, which sap remembers a chew, long enough to turn interest into lingering. Fish were persuaded rather than pursued when streams ran polite, a weir of stones narrowing the water's opinion until it agreed to show its silver. The timing of all this mattered more than the strength of arms. You plant the idea of a meal in the evening and harvest it in the morning. You tune the distance between camps to match the time it takes for a root to shed its bitterness in a stream, or for meat to glaze in smoke until it can travel. Food needed not only finding, but stretching. Meat hung in the wind and listened to smoke, turning from perilously fresh into thoughtfully kept. Fat was a treasure you saved in shaded hollows, inside carved bark, or in the cool attention of a stream, to be coaxed back into usefulness with a careful flame on a harsh day. Seeds and nuts were not just pockets of calories, but lessons in patience. Soak, crack, grind, taste, adjust, repeat. Berries arrived all at once, a generosity that could drown you unless you knew how to make time hold still. So they flattened sweetness into sun-thinned strips or buried baskets in the coolness under a particular stone that always felt as if it had a winter inside it. The best storage was invisible. Caches were disguised as ordinary stones, as casual brush piles, as stories only the right ears could hear. Fire did more than warm. It negotiated with time. You could put a question to fire. Will this wood smoke or sing? Will this root surrender? Will this stone burst or bless? And it would answer honestly if you learned how to ask. Embers were carried like sleeping children between camps, tucked into cradles of punky wood or fungus that remembered heat without flashing into flame. Starting a fire from scratch was possible, but keeping one alive felt wiser. So the last to sleep banked coals under ash, and the first to wake breathed them back into presence. The circle around the flames was also a school. Old hands showed new hands how to read the way fat flickers on a roasting piece, how to rake coals so that heat behaves, how to place stones to make a little oven out of nowhere. Songs happen there, yes, but also the measuring of the next day, which slope to trust, which mouth to feed first, which tool to fix before the light thins. Shelter was not a single design, but a catalogue of answers to weather's questions. Wind from the north, a wall of brush that lets air through, without giving it speed. A sleeping line curled like commas so that bodies speak warmth to one another. Rain that does not mean to stop. A shallow trench to invite water elsewhere. A roof made from layered branches that tells drops to slip away. Cold that means to test you. Beds raised on springy boughs to keep the ground's hunger from stealing heat. Where there were trees, homes leaned into them. Where there were none, homes leaned into stones. And where even stones were shy, the earth itself was sculpted into a place to rest, scooped just enough to give the back a reason to sigh. Moving often does not mean you cannot be comfortable. It means comfort is a kit you carry in your hands and your habits. Children were the memory of the group that hadn't happened yet. The care of them was everyone's job, because their breath was the argument you made against the season's indifference. They learned through work disguised as play, piling stones into little walls that would one day become useful, mimicking the soft footfalls that keep birds singing rather than alarming into the air, practicing throws with light sticks until the angle of release lived in the shoulder. Stories were shaped to be portable, hung on rhythms that matched walking, repeated in ways that braided information into the pleasure of a tale. At the place where two hills lean together, the water tastes of stone, a grandparent would say, and a child would repeat it in sleep until the phrase became a map under the tongue. Sharing was not charity, it was engineering. A big animal brought down in a lucky corridor fed many mouths, but the distribution was tuned for tomorrow as much as for today. The best cut went to the one who would need the longest range, the soft bits to the elders who had earned sweetness in their bones, the marrow to the children whose bodies were negotiating with rapid growth. In the lean months, each bite was a vote, and the voting remembered who had limped last season, who had stood against a cat when a child tripped, who had eyes that could read distant dust. Debts were not tallied in words, but in glances and reflexes. You passed your portion before anyone asked, because you had been fed the day you had nothing in your hands, and the memory of that taste was a law that required no enforcement. Watercraft, when needed, were not boats as we think of them, but understandings of buoyancy, bundles of reeds that shrugged at weight, logs coaxed to accept a rider across a shy stretch of river, a shallow crossing used at dusk when the water agreed to wear shadow. Where coasts permitted, hands learned the words for tide without ever using numbers, the particular hush of a retreating sea, the soft argument of advancing water, the places where rocks with green hair held shellfish even when the world felt otherwise empty. A tide line could be read like a family's mood. You knew whether to ask for much or for little by the gleam it left on stones. Illness visited, and there were answers for that too. Rest was rationed like food and given with the same fierce practicality. Warmth was not wasted on the sick. It was invested in them. Plant knowledge walked with the group, a bitter leaf that asked the gut to settle, a bark that made the mouth numb and turned the edge off pain, a steam that asked the chest to loosen its hold. Comfort came also in arrangement. Who sleeps beside the fever so the fever knows it is watched? Who hums the low song that seems to tell a mind it can fall and still be caught? Who takes the patient's work without making a ceremony out of it so that pride stays unbruised? Healing was not a separate art. It was what cooperation looked like when a body stumbled. Timekeeping lived in the body as well. The year had a taste, a first tang of certain greens, a particular grit in wind, a color the bark wears when it wants to be peeled, that told people where they were in the long circle. Moon cycles pulled on memory. This is the night the fish rise in the narrow part of the river. This is the morning the birds teach their young to fly and leave behind an abundance of inattentive flutter. Not every pattern held each year, but enough of them did that a net of expectations could be thrown over the future and pull back something useful. When the net brought up only weeds, they did not curse the water. They stitched the mesh tighter in places where the current had proven itself sly. Even conflict was managed with an eye towards survival. Voices rose sometimes. Humans are not snow. We do not always fall softly. But anger wastes heat, and heat is precious. So space was the medicine. A person walked to the edge of camp and arranged their breathing with the wind until a thought that was too sharp to hold began to cool. Agreements were small are numerous rather than grand and rare. We do not light a fire here because the smoke will talk to cats. We do not sleep there because the ground remembers water. We do not walk between the fire and the elders after dusk because the eyes behind us need the flame to think. These rules wore the skin of habit and thus did not chafe. At night, while the stars reminded everyone that the world is both large and specific, someone kept the ember watch, and someone else shaped tools in the orange quiet. The shaping was not just about edges. It was about keeping the mind tuned to purpose when darkness invited too much thought. A hand that knows how to bring a dull scraper back to service is a hand that knows how to bring a fearful mind back to curiosity. By morning, new edges were waiting in a neat row, and the day had one less excuse to be difficult. The small band rose, not all at once, but with the gentle stagger of those who have learned to let each other wake without hurry. And the plan, never complicated, always exact, took shape in the way feet found their places on the path, in the way someone remembered to lift the bundle of kindling, in the way the last glance at the fire was a promise that another fire would be listening by evening. The story that says our ancestors thinned to a near-vanishing line is told in two languages at once, and neither is complete without the other. One language is written in living bodies, the quiet spelling of genes carried in blood and bone and breath, while the other is pressed into the earth. Stone tools, scattered teeth, a femur that has forgotten its original stride but remembers weight. When people say there was a great squeeze, they are often listening to the first language, the genomic one, where the spacing between tiny differences in our DNA can be translated into a curve that rises and falls across time. A dip in that curve, long and deep, looks like a bottleneck. It looks like nights where there were fewer fires on the hills. But there is a second group of listeners who say the curve can be a trick of echoes. That structure, many small groups exchanging people like careful gifts, can make the song sound like a single voice growing faint, when in truth it is several voices moving in and out of earshot. In the first telling, you begin with simple ingredients, mutation rates, generation times, a model of how past populations might have mixed. You stir them into mathematics that behaves like patient eavesdropping. The method sits in a dark room, listening through static, and tries to pick out the rhythm of how many ancestors were present at each turn of the clock. If it hears a long quiet, it reports a drought of people. But the tempo matters. Change the assumed age at which parents have children, and the whole song speeds up or slows down. The pitch matters. Choose a different mutation rate. tuned by a different fossil anchor, and notes shift. Even the room matters. If the model assumes everyone sang together in one hall, and in reality, singers stood in far-flung alcoves and passed verses along the corridor, the recording will mislead without meaning to. In the second telling, you step outside and let your eyes adjust to weathered facts. Ancient bones are few in the ages we most wish to see, because time is hard on the delicate. Teeth sometimes endure and speak in the language of enamel proteins. Tools endure more often, chipped stories scattered in the dirt. Layers of earth offer dates like landmarks, half faded by rain. A hillside remembers a camp in a stain of charcoal. A cave remembers hands in the soot of a ceiling. A shoreline remembers someone who loved smooth pebbles so much they carried them home. This evidence is clear in its shape, but sparse in its distribution, like constellations that wait for interpretation. You can see people moving through particular valleys at particular times, and you can infer that they were not entirely few, because the trail of their decision-making lies persistent across miles and centuries. Yet even here, the gaps are large enough to slip a whole theory through. Between the two languages, argument rises, not as a shout, but as careful questions set on the table and turned in the light. Could a mosaic of small, semi-isolated bands create genetic signals that resemble a single, severe crash? Could waves of migration from neighboring refuges stitch over a local slump so that archaeology shows continuity where genetics sees contraction? Could selection favor certain gene regions and make them look older or younger than they are, pulling on the lines of the picture, the way damp stretches paper on a drawing board? The map of the past is sensitive to assumptions that feel technical, but are, in truth, choices about rhythm. How often people moved between groups, how wide the rivers were in culture rather than in water, how long a lineage can remain quiet in one corner and then suddenly radiate. Some of the disagreement lives in our sampling too. We listen to the genomes of people alive today and of the few ancestors whose molecules were lucky enough to hide in cold and dark, but we do not hear those who left no descendants or left them in places we have not yet looked. The portrait is drawn from survivors of many civs, and survivorship sketches can be flattering or cruel, all in unexpected ways. A single region can carry the memory of a narrow valley, while another region carries the memory of an open plain. Combine them without care, and the averaged landscape you get might resemble nowhere rather real. One lab will favor a certain filter for damage in ancient molecules. Another will choose a different one. Each aims at honesty. Each shapes the melody just slightly differently, like two flutes made from different reeds. Climate adds a third voice. one that does not speak of people directly, but of the rooms they were forced to live in. Ice cores raise thin blue candles of air and light them for us, showing rises and falls in cold. Ocean sediments collect microscopic shells that tell a story in oxygen's subtle preferences, and that story says the world shifted its rhythm during those far winters, lengthening the deep freezes, tightening the noose of habitability in some regions while loosening it in others. It is easy to look at the climate record and nod along with the idea of a prolonged squeeze, to say yes, the corridors narrowed. Yes, the refuges became islands. Yes, the maps demanded redrawing. But a world can be unfriendly in patches and still hold many more people than a single continent-wide whisper suggests. And that is where the debate slides its fingers between data and inference and tests the seam for strength. There are also the names we give to bones, which can convince us that boundaries were brighter than they felt to those who wore them. One scholar might look at a brow ridge and see a lineage distinct. Another might see a variation within a roaming, interwoven family. If lineages interbred, as the genomes of later times plainly show they often did, then clean categories blur, and the demographic signals woven from those categories blur in turn. A bottleneck in one branch can be softened by a trickle from another, just as a narrow canyon sounds wider if you let a second stream of water pour in from a side ravine. If you only measure the main channel, you might conclude the river ran thin. Measure the confluence, and suddenly there is more water than your first cup imagined. The tools used to read the genetic record are not one thing. They are families of methods, each trained to notice certain shapes in the data. Some listen for the way long blocks of DNA are broken down over time by recombination, like a pattern of tiles being shattered and re-glued across generations. Others lean closer to the frequency of rare variants, those faint stars that tell you how distant a past expansion or contraction might be. None of the methods are wrong, exactly. Each has sensitivities and blind spots, the way some ears are better at catching high notes, while others are faithful to the drum. This is not a defect in science, but its texture. You learn more by carrying several instruments and checking whether they harmonize. And then there is the quiet force of selection, which can peel away harmful changes and polish helpful ones, carving the genetic surface so that it no longer reflects a clean image of demographic history. A drop in diversity around a useful gene can mimic the shadow of a population crash, the same way a gust of wind can mimic an approaching storm in the reeds. Good models try to set selection aside, or at least keep it from leaning too hard on the picture, but removing the influence of something that has been at work for hundreds of thousands of years is like trying to subtract the taste of smoke from a fish that has lived over coals. You can get close, but you will always be aware of what the heat has done. The skeptics of a near extinction do not deny hardship. They ask for humility about what can be claimed from tangled lines. They point to alternative pasts that produce similar present-day patterns, a chain of refugees linked by occasional crossings, a long period of substructure where families got used to hearing their own accents and only sometimes blended them, a world of ebb and flow where no single trough dominated the whole basin. The proponents of the bottleneck do not deny complexity. They ask us to take seriously the length and depth of the dip they see in the curves, to consider that the squeeze might not have been a single blow, but a prolonged diet of scarcity, the kind that reshapes a body without leaving a single scar to point to. Between these camps, there is less combat than care. New data arrive, and both sides move their markers, not as a retreat, but as a refinement. A better date on a cave layer nudges a timeline. A genome from an unexpected place adds a wrinkle. A revised mutation rate retunes the song by a fraction. The map pinned to the wall is redrawn in pencil so often that the paper wears thin in the corners, and someone tapes it quietly from behind. Students learn that the reward for being almost right is the chance to be a little more right tomorrow. That certainty is not a fire to be defended, but a lantern to be trimmed. If you step back from the argument and listen to its temperature, you hear something reassuring. We are not arguing about whether people lived. We are arguing about how many and how close together, and for how long they endured the narrowness. The bones do not shout in chorus, but neither do they fall silent. The genes do not write in ink, but neither do they refuse to be read. It is the nature of deep time to make us squint. It is the nature of careful minds to keep their questions soft at the edges until the evidence hardens them. The past is not obliged to make itself simple just because we are tired, but it does reward patience with slightly clearer silhouettes each time we look. So the gentle disagreement becomes a kind of shelter of its own, a structure built from opposing beams that hold a roof steady over our curiosity. Under that roof, one person speaks for the long, low dip in the genetic curve, and another speaks for the hidden complexity that can masquerade as a dip, and a third person sits with a handful of stones from a riverbed, and a fourth holds a tiny shard of tooth enamel. And they compare their pieces without pretending they already know the finished mosaic. The result is not indecision. It is a moving answer that tracks the moving ground, the way a band adjusts its path when a familiar spring shifts a few steps downhill, the way a hunter changes approach when the wind forgets itself and turns, the way a family listens to one another until the plan fits the weather that actually exists rather than the weather that was expected. The past does not speak to us in thunder. It murmurs in the small ways we still survive our days. It is there, in the patience of hands that retie a loose knot rather than throw the bundle away, in the quiet way we check the door and the stove and the window latch as night arrives, in the soft arithmetic of sharing that decides who gets the last warm slice and who pretends they are already full. It is there when we choose a path by the feel of the ground, rather than the length of the shortcut, when we stand and test the wind with our skin before we step out, when we pause at a threshold and listen to a room, the way our ancestors listened to a tree line. The lesson that traveled from their fires to our kitchens is not decorated. It is the clean, durable idea that life continues when we arrange ourselves around one another with care. We carry their resilience in our breath without noticing. Inhale like someone who remembers the cold. Exhale like someone who makes room for the next moment. That rhythm held camps together when food ran thin and the sky leaned closer. It holds families now when the measure of scarcity is time rather than meat. The old technology we inherit is not flint or sinew or pitch. It is attention, the habit of noticing more than is required, of asking a second question, even when the first answer would do. Attention is how a child learns the turn in a parent's voice that means not yet. It is how a crew reads a shift in weather by the shine on a window. It is how a friend hears the fractionally longer pause before the word fine and knows to stay a little longer. Kindness might have been our smartest tool. It kept groups elastic enough to bend without breaking. It was efficient, not sentimental. A bowl passed to steady, thin legs that will be needed for tomorrow's walk. A blanket adjusted in the night because someone heard a shiver. A job swapped without ceremony because the hand that can carve today will need that strength again when the season turns. We have renamed kindness many times: teamwork, culture, social glue. But its physics have not changed. A group that knows how to carry one another's edges travels farther with less waste, and the world, in any era, respects thrift. The past teaches that flexibility is a form of memory. When the river moved, people did not debate the river. They moved with it and stored the feeling of that change so the next move came cleaner. We do this now when we learn a new route home after construction, when we shift a routine so a toddler can nap, and everyone else's day still more or less works, when we learn a neighbor's schedule enough to carry their parcel in from the hall before rain finds it. Adaptation is simply respect expressed as choreography. The wind has preferences, light has limits, other people have days that are heavy, and our movement improves when we let those facts edit us. Even the way we keep and share knowledge still echoes those long evenings. Much of what mattered then could not be written, either because there was no writing yet, or because the lesson was too quick to pin down. Which twig angles make smoke lie flat? The time between two bird calls that means a cat is close. The taste that tells a root has finished surrendering its bitterness. So knowledge passed inside of tasks, embedded in the hands, braided into jokes and songs, and the order in which things were done. We do this too when we teach by cooking together, rather than pointing at a recipe, when we fix a squeak in a door while telling a story that pretends to be about something else, when we say watch instead of listen, and the watching turns out to be the listening after all. They left us rituals because rituals save energy. The same cup hung in the same place saved 100 small searches. The same path to the stream wore a groove that steadied ankles. The same watch order at night meant no one spent precious thinking on who should wake whom. Our version is a list on the back of a cupboard, a bag that always holds the spare charger, the order in which we check the rooms before leaving. Habit is a machine that returns us to readiness with less fuel. And in climates of uncertainty, be it ice or deadlines, fuel is more valuable than pride. What they believed about danger was unsentimental and useful. Fear is a counselor you invite to the meeting and then seat near the door. It tells you when to move differently. It does not get to move you alone. We practice the same governance when we look both ways, even on a green light, when we carry a small light in a pocket, even in familiar streets, when we let caution speak, and then decide with the rest of our senses. Courage rarely felt like shouting. It felt like taking the next quiet step exactly as planned, while the body makes its case for turning back. Our bodies remain persuasive. Our planning remains kinder. Our inheritance includes how to rest. Rest was not downtime, it was maintenance. People slept with their bones aligned to lose the least heat, with their bellies settled by what the evening allowed, with their tools within reach so the mind could unclench. The modern echo is a phone charged before bed, so tomorrow has no excuse. Shoes placed where morning feet will find them without thinking. A glass of water poured for the person you will be in the dark hours when thirst wakes you. Rest is the opposite of neglect, and neglect, like cold, steals in through any gap we leave. From them, we learn to see promise in small things. The sight of birds gathering in a certain way could mean easy fish. The smell of resin in the breeze could mean dry kindling nearby. The sound a hillside makes under frost could mean a stream that will free itself by midday. The contemporary version is noticing a neighbor's laugh, returning after a long absence, a patch of sunlight that moves across a desk like the hour's hand and tells you when to step outside, a plant that leans toward a window and announces where the room secretly wants to be. Recognizing such cues is how we avoid pushing a door the wrong way all day. They survived by making future selves into members of the group. The meat smoked today was a gift to the person waking hungry tomorrow. The tools sharpened at dusk were a favor to mourning hands. We do this when we write a note our tired brain will believe, when we fold a coat where a rushed version of us will find it, when we pay down a small debt that would otherwise grow teeth in the night. Treating tomorrow like someone you love is an old practice. It feels new only because we keep forgetting its comfort. They honored limits without resenting them. A stream crosses where it can. A fire eats what it's given. A body does its best within its weather. In our time, this becomes an ease with finishing when the light fades, with saying this much is plenty, with letting a plan be smaller than an ambition. So the group does not shiver. Limits are not insults. They are shapes, and shapes help us build. They also knew how to return. A band that tried a valley and found it stingy did not consider itself defeated. It considered itself better informed for the next test. We practice this when we revisit a difficult conversation with quieter words, when we try a new angle on an old habit, when we reheat a cooled plan in a warmer context. Returning is not repeating. It is circling with knowledge, the way birds study updrafts before committing their wings. The past tells us that meaning is a practical tool. People kept small tokens, smooth stones, a feather that had chosen a child, a twist of fiber rubbed shiny by worry, not because superstition was easier than work, but because symbols concentrate attention and soothe the nervous system enough to let work happen. We tie a bracelet, wear a ring, tuck a note in a wallet, not to summon magic, but to anchor a self that has to act inside a storm. The charm does not save you. It stabilizes your hand while you save yourself. Generosity scales the way strength does. A single generous gesture can calm a whole group's breathing. The piece of meat someone gives up today is less important than the message carried in that gift. We do not eat alone here. The modern meal is time, listening, patience for someone's slow story, the willingness to be bored for a friend who needs to walk in circles to find their point. The calories are different. The nourishment is the same. They taught us to make tools that teach while they work. A well-set weir makes the river explain itself. A line of stones placed just so turns wind into a tutor about how air moves. A child's toy that rolls with a certain wobble explains friction without a lecture. Our tools still do this. A notebook that makes ideas visible shows you which ones want to live. A calendar that refuses to be overstuffed tells you you're not a river. A pan that sticks when you rush insists on heat as a conversation, not a demand. Good tools correct us without scolding. Perhaps the deepest lesson is about scale. Life is not won at the size of continents. It is kept at the size of bowls and glances and footsteps. Big stories, migrations, transitions, the long squeeze of climate are made of small agreements carried out on hard mornings. When you sweep a threshold, you are adjusting the world's mood within reach. When you speak gently to a tired face, you are editing the weather around a single fire. When you move a chair so the sun can find you, you are aligning with forces larger than language. This scale is not small. It is the scale at which the future becomes possible. We also inherited the practice of gratitude that does not require a speech. A hand pressed to a shoulder at the right moment is a complete sentence. A nod across a room can carry the load of a paragraph. A shared silence that sets heavy packs down for a count of 10 can make 5 more miles thinkable. We say thank you now with dishes done before they ask, with a text that says safe home, with a door held and a day remembered. Gratitude is not a ceremony we perform for the world. It is the grease that keeps the old gears of cooperation from grinding into heat. And when the dark leans in, as it always does in its season, the old murmur is very simple. Stay near, body to body, story to story. Keep a little flame where eyes can find it. Tell the names of places as if they were relatives you are proud to introduce. Make plans that are honest about the weather. Save a sweetness for a morning that may be thin, and walk with a pace that lets you hear the land when it changes its mind, because it will, and because you know how to change with it. Thank you for drifting through deep time with me tonight. If you're still awake, let me know in the comments what moment stayed with you and where in the world you're listening from. If this helped you unwind, a gentle tap on like and subscribe keeps the fire going for the next quiet journey. For now, breathe out, close your eyes, and let the long road of history carry you the rest of the way to sleep. Good night.